So today on Data Radicals, I've got with me Wendy Turner-Williams. Wendy is somebody who I've had the privilege of knowing for maybe the better part of a decade, and something like that. And it's been fun because I've learned as much about data management from her as anybody in our customer set that I've known. So it's a great privilege to be with her today. Wendy, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Satyen. It's wonderful to be here, and I appreciate the honor of knowing that you've learned from me around data management. I think we've learned a lot from each other on that topic over the last period of time that we've known each other.
Tell us about what it's like to work on data inside of a software company where you're both working on data but also responsible for producing software to manage data.
Yeah, I think that is, a very interesting role to be in when it comes to being a data professional, is being a data professional within a software company that produces data. And that the reason behind that is because there's a reality of, the complexities related to data, meaning quality or latency issues or, integration gaps, or even sometimes our infrastructure when it comes to supporting kind of enterprise cross scenarios, or even the complexities of the different org structures and the business units and their priorities that come into play, that often when you're developing the software, you're thinking in bits or features, and you don't always have your fingers on kind of the nuances and the churn in the system around the soft points, right, that come with data. And I think that's kind of the differences to me, is that sometimes, when it comes to software engineering, software engineers don't necessarily always use their software, nor again understand these competing types of priorities or conflict points or touch points that actually kind of really kind of drive a lot of influence into the actual internal data processes, as far as actually impact or scalability or delivery. So for me, I try to really center myself as and present myself as almost like a customer zero, right? Like, I'm like, if we can develop software that meets my needs, and my needs are holistic and, cross enterprise in nature, and I'm looking at different analytics approaches, platform approaches, data management approaches, advanced analytics approaches, you name it. And if we can create software that makes my life easier, and I can provide that feedback loop as far as the experience or the features or the use cases that are gaps, then I try to do so, because I feel like it's my responsibility being in software to help make that experience better for all.
This idea of tying data to strategy, I think, is one that often is either overlooked or underappreciated. So I'd love for you to dive in there a little bit. How is the strategy defined? What is your role in providing data? Tell us a little bit more about how that process works internally.
Yes. So I think that, definition of strategy is something that is, a community thing, meaning there's different pieces that make up a holistic strategy for a company, meaning there could be financial avenues, there could be emerging market avenues, there could be product and product features avenues, or scalability of infrastructure, or your workforce, you name it. There's different things that all make up part of a strategy for you as a company. And to me, the role of the CDO is somewhat like it's kind of like a glue mechanism. It's a seat at the table. It's a seat at the table as each one of these strategies are discussed, who's basically trying to define and decide, what data is needed in order to support those strategies in a proactive way, as well as the infrastructure or the governance or the data handling, other different aspects that are also needed to do that. So to me, it's again, how do you actually make that strategy come to life in a way that you can measure that business value and the ROI in return towards that strategy in regards to the investment that happens. So again, sometimes I find it really interesting when there's certain companies who, make blanket statements around, I have done X, but how do you know you've done X? Did you measure that you did X? And when did you do X? And, there's different pieces that come to that question in regards to, was X actually done, or the definition of done, or did it actually land the way that you expected it to do so? So again, it's kind of an interesting thing where data really plays this underlying, almost like foundational role in regards to bringing strategy to life through questions. And how do you measure these things?
Yeah, it's funny because one of the hard challenges in talking to so many chief data officers is that often with data, you can be in this place where you go in 15 different directions. You can try to document every source. You can try to get all of the lineage of all of the data. You can try to cover compliance use cases and offensive use cases, and it's super easy to get lost. But this idea of like, well, look, my strategy as a chief data officer is to just follow the company strategy and to enable that. Uh, guide or could be a mechanism to guide so much of the investment dollar and so much of the bridge to the business. And I think that's a really interesting observation that I don't think happens as often as it ought to.
Yeah, definitely. You have a role, right? I really think about data and chief data officers as they're like a supporting actor, right, to the corporate entity as a whole. And you've got to have those partnerships. You have to have those those breakout moments where you're working in unison with these particular business units who are executing on these strategies all up. You need to be able to talk to others. You have to be able to have a learner's mindset. You have to understand, what different teams and functions do and how they play into a bigger picture, so that you can get into cause and effect. And then when you start to do that, whether it's a data role or many other roles, you have a lot more ability to actually have impact.
Any tips or tricks on how to do that?
I'm a big believer in culture, and I'm a big believer in kind of networking. So one-on-ones I think is a big avenue. I am someone who, as soon as I join a team, and every day I have the org chart up. Every day, every moment, it's always on my on my laptop, and I'm always trying to understand, like, who's this person, and they roll up to what org, and they do what, and who else do I know there, and wait, I think I remember this other team was doing something similar, and who was that again, and let me connect them. So it's not even always about my own networking. I'm constantly playing glue between different teams and different functions in regards to where they can have mutual interests or where they can learn from one another as well. And to me, that starts to build kind of a reputation as a go-to person where people start to come to you. So I don't have to necessarily seek out. People actually come as well. But I use, councils, I use, external engagement mechanisms, whether LinkedIn or other social avenues. And then I schedule a lot of one-on-ones and keep them. I think when you build relationships, they can't be one and done. They've got to be an ongoing conversation.
You recently published a report with Forrester at Tableau, and it was all about building data literacy. Tell us what you found.
Yeah, it was incredibly interesting. Like, for example, one of the findings that we had was that 39% of organizations surveyed basically say that data training is available to all employees. But if they went back and actually spoke to a lot of the decision makers, then I think it was 82% of decision makers expect basic data literacy for all of their employees. So in other words, there's over a 50% gap between the amount of literacy and training that's actually being provided to the employees versus the employer expectation about these employees actually having basic literacy skills, which seems to be a huge disconnect, right?
So why do you think that is? I mean, Tableau's been around now for 20 years. Alation's been around for 10 years. Like, why haven't we all figured this out?
Yeah, I think there is just a, somewhat of a disconnect in regards to what a corporation or what an employee perceives as a employment or an employee actual avenue as far as their own self learning and self training versus what a corporation should actually provide to make sure that their workforce skills become and maintain being relevant, right? So I think that there's just a disconnect between what they need to do. Everyone knows that we need to have training related to safety or, think security or, various things like that. But, training related to how do you write a SQL query? Or how do you actually, create a report is somewhat considered optional instead of being a mandatory type of training to make sure everybody is grounded in some type of basics.
Yeah, and training's always a tough thing for managers to invest in because the ROI isn't always apparently immediate, even if it
Yeah.
is super obvious that it's needed. So how do you convince your customers and I mean even internally within Tableau, tell us about the training. How does that happen? How do these programs get funded? Are they getting funded more often?
Yeah, within Tableau, of course, this is a huge effort for us. We're definitely focused on funding, because not only are we looking at funding internally, we're also made a commitment or a pledge to basically skill up. I think 10 million, data skills over the next, I think it's 3 years by 2025. So, I mean, that's a public, actual, pledge that we've done, of which we're living that internally. So one of the ways that we've invested is the creation of this CDO function. And within this CDO function, we actually have a data literacy effort and a whole focal group who's building out curriculum, who's working with, educational institutes or third-party partners in regards to literacy programs as well, while also looking to package up our own internal literacy about our own culture or our own data products, or not just data products, I'm sorry, but our actual business processes all up and the various software and products that we use across the board. So that is something that is an explicit function that has been actually tied to our corporate commitments this year with actual resourcing that has come with it. And as far as ROI, one of the things that you call out, and one of the things that we found in this Forrester survey was that nearly 80% of employees who actually, 80% of employees were more likely to stay at a company that basically offered data skills. So you think about ROI, 80% is a huge number in regards to actually becoming, happy within that company and wanting to stay. And just think about the actual influence that happens too. And at this time of the Great Resignation, and at this time where we're having generational shifts around just the amount of workforce that we have, it's incredibly important.
Yeah, it's funny because I think people it'd be really hard as a CEO or an executive at a company to say, hey, we really don't believe that we need more data. We've got all the data that we need. That would be an odd statement to make. And you also have now data that says, hey, look, if you invest in your people, they're more likely to stick around, in particular for these roles where there's negative unemployment, right? I mean, it is really hard to find a data scientist or a business analyst. And if you have those two realities, you might as well invest in the training because it may show up in lower attrition and better business performance, but you're not going to be able to measure it immediately.
That's right. That's right. I mean, again, I think, every company is at a different point in time, depending on even the industry you are probably related to your attrition rates, et cetera. So, but I'm with you. I think that there's a correlation that's easy for companies to actually measure when it comes to seeing the ROI based on those attrition rates versus the investment, as well as even, again, back to strategy. It'd be interesting to tie literacy to not just attrition and employee happiness, but also back to strategy execution, right? And how those progress and how those plot in some type of line against one another. I think that'd be a really interesting kind of data set.
Maybe stepping back a little though, tell us and the audience, what is the data fabric? What does it mean? And why should people think about that architectural paradigm or trend? And why is it relevant to most?
When I think about a fabric, I think about this kind of middle tier angle that kind of wraps around your end-to-end kind of data processes, whether it's compute and store up to your orchestration engines and your query engines up to, your actual KPIs, metrics, and visualizations. Like it's something that kind of goes throughout the process that helps you to basically manage, have insights, and to govern that information kind of appropriately. So again, if you think about Tableau prep, where you talk about catalog, etc., think of these as more extensibilities into your more upstream data points, so that you can understand full pipeline health. You can understand, what type of data is available to actually enrich the existing kind of KPIs and metrics that you might have visualized within, within Tableau all up. It just gives you more of the ability to both enrich as well as to find and discover as well as to manage. So if I tend to think about things like, trust kind of angles, think like GDPR or CCPA, right? Waiting to understand a catalog from a last mile perspective does not help you necessarily support things like right to be forgotten or delete me, right? You need to be able to understand a full pipeline stack, and you need to understand your role around that data. Are you a processor? Are you a sub-processor? What is your role, so that you can actually kind of operationalize a lot of the compliance support needed to actually support GDPR, CCPA all up.
Makes sense. And I guess in some sense, it's a new paradigm to attack an old problem, which is data governance. And you've obviously run governance programs for a lot of your career. And you talk about data governance. Tell us, how do you see data governance changing? I mean, there's always been this sort of element of process and procedure and a heaviness to it. Do you see that evolving or changing over time? And what's going to change? What's going to be the same?
Yeah, it has evolved, thankfully. I for one am not a process for process person. I am a process automation person, and I don't know the last time you read a policy, but most people tend to read them and or not read them and not discover them. So very much, I'm a person who believes in right size governance and also believes in kind of governance automation. I think when it comes to the scale of the scale and volume of data in the modern world, you cannot have manual processes just don't scale. Whether it's for quality or whether it's for policy or stewardship, in stewardship driving access control, like this is all about automations and all about the platforms to automate those things. So I tend to, from my perspective, I tend to focus on what are those processes? What are those automation points? And then how do I actually build those in an intuitive way, almost like an application experience that really bakes into an intuitive user experience, so that the process piece or the governance aspect is almost like buried into just the data engineering lifecycle, or the data analytics lifecycle. And it just becomes an intuitive piece to where we're guiding people to what they want and what they need and the processing that they need to do. And governance is almost like baked in around them in a way that they can't quite see it, but all of the right things are happening from a handling perspective or a policy perspective, intuitively.
So we've talked a little bit about data literacy. We've talked about data fabric. We've talked about certainly this idea of a automation and change. Let's talk a little bit about the how. So you implement the tech stack for data at Tableau. What is that tech stack, and how have you designed it, and how do you pick your priorities in terms of what to build as you augment that tech stack?
Yeah, so we like so many others, right? I think out there, we kind of live in a hybrid model. We have a mix of on-prem and cloud, multi-cloud, even substrates. So we've got a mix of AWS, we've got some Azure, we've got some GCP, because I'm doing cross-enterprise in nature types of analytics. And we've got different people that are on different funnels depending on the business unit. And then we've got a mix of have other cloud services like Snowflake, et cetera, that we're using for things like, curation store and, modernized ETL services. We also, as you know, are a big Alation customer as well. So we're using Alation as part of our kind of data management stack, as well as some other services around data quality and lineage, et cetera, that we're kind of deepening some of what you get outside of Alation, to really make sure that we have kind of a shared data services model that can support any of our internal data teams based on their own agility and their own business priorities. So I tend to separate from a priority perspective. I tend to separate what I'm doing on platform and the services from what I'm doing from a prioritization related to like data engineering or analytics. Those are two different functions, two different teams, in which we're focused on where we can actually improve our service health or scalability or, availability related to our platforms, as well as adding new feature sets that bring more benefit to the collective good versus, siloed kind of, positive cases. And then from an analytics perspective, we really try to focus on enabling our business partners to define their own priority, and us executing against that priority, to support the strategies all up for those business teams. When it comes to, of course, since we're a shared service, we sometimes get prioritizations that are conflicting in nature. So, when that happens, we tend to, we've got mechanisms internally where we greenlight, we do it kind of in a very transparent way in which we have all of our business partners, and we bring them together to make shared decisions related to priorities when we have conflicts.
So in this process, I mean, one of the things that it strikes me about you, or at least that I've observed over the years, is that you've probably picked and used and tried and kicked out more technology than, frankly, anybody that I've ever seen or know. What are the lessons and the learnings there?
I think that, people need to understand what's the business value that they're intending to actually bring, and how do you actually measure that ROI? Like, I think too often people get focused on implementing tech, and they think that just the tech solves the data problem, but the tech is just a component to actually get to the value of data. There's actually the value itself, the data itself, and there's also, again, the culture and kind of the atmosphere that you're creating as well. And so, I don't think that tech always solves, your business problems. I think that tech is an avenue to help you as long as you understand your actual data need and your business need as well. So, my advice is always like fail fast if you're going to fail, and then adjust and move, right? Like iterate, don't be afraid of change, don't be afraid of asking questions. And again, ultimately, your job from a technology perspective or a software perspective is to solve business needs. And if it's not solving the business needs, why? Make sure you understand clearly those requirements and adjust.
Makes perfect sense. And you earlier in the conversation talked about the thing that this podcast is all about, which is data culture, or culture specifically, but obviously we here like to talk about data culture. How do you define data culture? How do you define culture? And what's a good one, and what's a good data culture, and how do we work towards it?
Yeah, I think data culture is, really trying to ensure that you have the people and the aptitude with the skill sets who really want to make data conscious decisions, meaning, not shooting from the hip, not shooting from your gut, but making informed, educated decisions based on, information. And to me, that's kind of what culture is. Now, I think the big thing with culture is that, just like, literacy, just like governance, just like strategy, it's not something that's one and done. It's a continuous process, right? And you're always trying to ingrain it so that it is the same as breathing, versus, an extra step. I've got to be, in my data culture hat so that I think this way, right? Like you want to make it intuitive. You want to make it something that's just natural and that it's something that everyone groks, not some people, but everyone. Using community to feed good behaviors, right? Or to make shifts as well, I think is important. So how do you feed, this cultural kind of animal, and keep it alive and kicking and constantly growing and thriving, right? I think it is one of the biggest challenges. The other piece I think when it comes to culture, and it's kind of the thing that data professionals never love to talk about, but data is very political, right? I mean, it's incredibly political. And I think that sometimes when it comes to culture, like you've got to have a culture that also not only wants to be data driven and use information, but you have to have a culture that again wants to have a learner's mindset and isn't afraid to ask questions and isn't afraid to challenge either, right? Like sometimes things should be challenged, and sometimes that is very positive for the collective whole. And having a culture who is grounded in the fact that that's accepted, and that you're learning from one another, and the culture as a whole is going to grow from the result of that, is something that is, I think, hard to do, but is also something that can differentiate, really solid cultures who are very, very successful and those who are not and tend to silo off.
So I can't, that statement's super interesting and I got to dive into it. So what does it mean? Tell us a little bit more about what it means for data to be political. Why is data political, and what does it mean to be political?
Yeah. So data, as you know, data is can be shared, right? It's like this living entity thing that can be used across multiple teams for multiple different purposes. But then sometimes with data comes a lot of heavy accountability, right? So you get into situations from a political standpoint where sometimes data, it makes sense that data is owned within certain functions, but then there's no accountability for that ownership because either they don't have the bandwidth, maybe they don't have the capacity, maybe they don't have the knowledge, whatever reason, there's no real kind of ownership that happens. The other thing that happens is that data is power, right? To me, again, people who know how to use data and know how to actually make decisions based on those data and amplify that message tend to sometimes create fiefdoms or silos of knowledge that can happen around that data. And sometimes that is really hard to break through because instead of working collectively against a common good, you could sometimes have people that go off into, again, kind of political atmospheres or Machiavellian mindsets and, not work for the broader good for the shared usage of that data. And, that happens all the time in data roles. It's something that I think that data professionals, especially data management professionals, are constantly trying to break down silos or, fiefdoms or, clear up accountability gaps or sometimes bring clarity to accountability issues as well, or quality issues is another big one, right? A lot of times people want to be the source of truth for data until there's quality issues associated to that data, and then there's the scurrying away, right, from that problem set. And again, so back to a political standpoint, sometimes, the data management role or the CDO role is bringing like, what do I want to say? Almost like, goodness or structure to some chaos. And I think there's just a lot of times political chaos that happens across the board.
Yeah, that is such a great observation. And it explains a lot of the why for what you talked about earlier, which was, look, I look at the org chart and I go and build relationships because I've got to figure out how to get people on my side and really on the company side, right? To go figure
Yes.
out how
Yeah.
to use the data. Any other tips and techniques that you would recommend to folks about breaking through those politics and breaking through those motivations?
I said I think always try to align on what is strategically advantageous to your company, right? Like always err on like the future state versus the existing state. I try to do another trick for me personally, not just networking, but I try to understand like who are the partners, like who are the people that really get it and who are the people who don't necessarily get it. And what I try to do is create enough energy in the system. It's almost like, when you're rolling a rock up, especially like when you first start some big initiative, like coming brand new into a company or some major problem that's going to cause a lot of, internal change or structural change, whatever that may be. What I try to do is I try to understand who are the players. Okay, are in all of those players, who tends to get it and be aligned, who's kind of a middle ground, and then who is someone who is opposed or doesn't have the time or seems like they're not really heavily engaged or are bought into the direction. And I almost tend to break them up into three groupings for myself. And then what I try to do is I try to network around those groupings to understand who influences who around those things. And then I